May it please Your Royal Highness, Professor Amartya Sen, Chairman of the first plenary session, Excellencies and distinguished guests, welcome to the first plenary session of the International Conference on Equitable Education, All for Education. The title of this plenary session is Equitable Education, What Does It Mean in the Changing World Amidst COVID-19 Pandemic? It is a great honor to moderate this session with an eminent chairman and prominent speakers. Before the session begins, please allow me to introduce the chairman of this plenary session. Professor Amartya Sen is currently Thomas Lamont University professor and professor of economics and philosophy at Harvard University. Professor Sen was awarded the 1998 Nobel Prize in Economic Science for his contribution to welfare economics and social choice theory, and for his interest in the problem of society poorest member. May I start by inviting Professor Amartya Sen to live introduce this plenary session from Boston, Massachusetts. It is already past midnight in Boston, Massachusetts now. May I invite Professor Amartya Sen to introduce this session to Her Royal Highness. Professor Sen, you may now begin. Thank you.
I'm not sure that I have much to say. Can you hear me at all?
Yes, sir.
You can hear me?
Yes, sir. We can hear you, sir.
Yeah. Because, I think the program got a bit mixed up compared with what I was told. So I think I was expecting some action earlier. But it's very nice to be here. It's very nice that such a meeting is taking place. It's very nice that the Royal Highness is present here. She's always a great source of inspiration and encouragement to everyone. So I hope the meeting goes well. I don't think I should be chairing any session because I'm quite exhausted also, having been teaching and involved with students all day and from the morning. But it's very good to, the most important thing, of course, is that the commitment to education for all that has been taken up is a very, very important one. And the international conference to celebrate it is certainly something we have very good reason to be happy about. And the importance of education comes from many directions. Leading a good life requires education, requires wisdom, but also requires education. Progress in social, economic, political fields depend on our education. And that way too, education has a contribution to make. But leading a life in which we can collaborate and interact with others requires also an education, and education therefore has all these different features. And finally, education gives one security, which we are learning more and more under COVID-19. And indeed, the countries which have been successful have benefited a lot from having a high level of general education. Thailand counts among them because the level of education here is higher than that in most developing countries. But of course, it can go further. And if it goes further, more achievements could be made. The fact that if you look at my country, India, the fact that it has become now the third largest COVID-infected country is a terrible happening on one side. And yet the fact that the one state which had a high level of education, namely Kerala, escaped that, and only a handful of people died, and the epidemic, the pandemic, came under control very quickly through intelligent planning of testing, tracing contact, and taking appropriate counteractive actions. That indicates how, with an educated society, you can deal with most problems, and even problems of the kind of COVID-19, which is new to the world, turns out to be one which education helps to control. So I think we admire education, and since this is a great boon for people, having equitable education is both good from the point of view of justice as well as good from the point of view of efficiency. So I'm delighted that this international conference is taking place. I'm delighted that Thailand has taken a commitment towards education for all in an even bigger way than it already had. And I'm also very happy that the people who I have known from earlier on, like my old friend and classmate, Anand, former Prime Minister Anand, that they are involved in it. And of course, above all, is the fact that we are getting the blessing, the encouragement, and the leadership of the Royal Highness, and that is going to be part of the possibility, part of the leadership assets that Thailand could benefit from. So I'm delighted about that. It's quite late since I've been up since early morning seeing my students here in Boston. I must go, but I express my warmest greetings to everyone, and also good luck, and also show my appreciation of the active people here, and particularly the leadership of the Royal Highness. So with those words, I must go. Thank you very much.
May it please Your Royal Highness, would you like to speak to Professor Sen for about 5 to 10 minutes?
So Professor Sen, thank you very much on behalf of all of us here that you can come online to join with us in these very important activities, that you help us to promote education in Thailand and perhaps in other places in the world. Then we still remember former with thanks that when I took my students to Calcutta, and you are kind enough to came to us and give us a lecture, and I took the note and type and distribute to everybody there, for fear that maybe if some students miss some words, so they can have your lecture with them all the time. And so I'm grateful for that too.
Thank you very much.
And I hope that in the future I will have the chance of meeting you in person. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Matayasen, Mr. Chair, for a very inspiring introduction. May it please Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, and distinguished guests, may I now invite the three speakers of this plenary session to commence their presentation. The plenary session 1 is now begin. Thank you. guests, Professor Amartya Sen, Chairman of the Plenary 1 session, Ms. Yasmin Sharif, Ms. Alice Albright, Dr. Prasan Tairat Vorakun, Excellency and distinguished guests. Welcome to the first plenary session of the International Conference on Equitable Education, All for Education. May I now invite Dr. Prasan to start the session. Dr. Prasan, the floor is yours.
Your Royal Highness, Professor Amartya Sen, Ms. Sharif, Ms. Albright, Excellency and distinguished guests. It is my privilege to be joining this plenary session with distinguished chair and speakers. The Equitable Education Fund is a new organization that looks up to the global organizations like the Global Partnership of Education, or GPE, and the Education Cannot Wait, ECW, as a benchmark and as an inspiration in designing and implementing our equitable education programs in Thailand. As a chair of the EEF's Board of Governance, I look forward to building a stronger partnership for the benefit of disadvantaged children, especially during the current global pandemic. 2020 is a very special year for the Equitable Education Agenda. Not only does it mark the 30th year of the World Declaration on Education for All in 1990 at the first World Conference on Education for All in Jomtien, Thailand. This year also starts the countdown to the last 10 years of the SDG 4. Throughout these past 3 decades, the Jomtien Declaration has been the inspirational cornerstone of both national and global commitment to education for all children across the world. More importantly, we have witnessed the progression of the EFA through Millennium Development Goals and later the Sustainable Development Goals to be more equitable, more integrated, and more instrumental, just to name a few. However, it would be an understatement to say that 2020 has posed many challenges to achieving EFA to any education system globally. Before COVID-19, there was already a number of unfinished businesses we owe to our children and promises to deliver by 2030. Not only has this global pandemic worsened the pre-existing education inequities, it has introduced new hardships to our society. In a nutshell, I think COVID-19 has effectively redefined how education organizations like us do business from top to bottom. Chairman, if you would allow, after Jasmine's presentation on ECW and Alice on GPE, I will share with you the past 2-year experiences of the EEF and how we are coping with the COVID disruption.
Thank you very much, Dr. Prasan. This is a very stimulating initial intervention. I would like now to invite our next speaker, Ms. Yasmin Sharif, to move our conversation on equitable education agenda from the national level in Thailand to the global picture, as well as to shed some light on the impact of COVID-19 on our children around the world. Ms. Sharif, the floor is yours.
Royal Highness, Professor Amartya Sen, Dr. Prasan, and also my dear friend Alice Albright. It's my pleasure to be part of this panel, and it's also my pleasure to return to the beautiful Thailand, even though via remote, which I visited several times, and to be here together with you. Your Royal Highness, distinguished panel members, and ladies and gentlemen, I will start by giving a very broad outline of the Education Cannot Wait Global Fund. The Global Fund for Education in Emergency was established by the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016. Why was it established? Because there was a realization that despite all the efforts we do, and everyone is trying, there were an approximately 75 million children and young people in school age who did not access a quality education in countries affected by conflict or by refugee populations or by natural disasters. So we are speaking about those countries on earth that are in the darkest, most difficult of all situations. Countries like Afghanistan, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Central African Republic, Chad, the whole Sahel, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Rohingyas who are hosted by Bangladesh, refugees, internally displaced, those who have lost everything because of violence and persecution and living in absolute abject poverty. They numbered before COVID-19 75 million. You have to have a very crisis-sensitive approach. And that's how Education Cannot Wait was created, to complement the Global Partnership for Education, complement other major funds doing education. Our job was to focus on crisis, conflict, and refugees. Now, when we look at COVID-19, the number of 75 million has only increased. The Malala Fund has estimates that 10 million girls, in addition, out of the 39 million, 50% of the 75 million, an additional 10 million of girls will now fall out of school and may never return as a result of COVID-19. In the countries who are currently affected by COVID-19 and yet has not reached the same numbers that we have elsewhere in the world. We look at sub-Saharan Africa, we look at parts of the Middle East, they have not reached, or at least not been able to monitor the same amount of number of COVID-19 cases, but nevertheless, their schools are closed. And when you are very poor, absolute extreme poverty, and you are in a country of conflict or you're a refugee, then on top of it comes COVID-19 and you can't go to school, you are doubly affected. You have one massive human suffering that you've been struggling with for years, and now you have COVID-19 on top. So what we see today, because in many of these countries, you don't have the infrastructure for IT. You don't have infrastructure for web-based learning, access to a computer. You may not even have access to a radio or a television. Large parts of Afghanistan don't have electricity. Central African Republic will not have access to electricity or the infrastructure. So what it tells us is that COVID-19 has displayed to us the inequities, the socioeconomic inequities that are across the globe. A child in Sweden can study online from home and use web-based learning and technology. A child in Chad or in Nigeria or in South Sudan cannot. So what was already a huge divide in development has now further deepened that divide, because they are learning online, they can't even learn online. So, and what happens also because of the poverty is girls are especially at risk now, because with COVID-19 comes an economic recession. So girls, they're out of school. And what happens in countries of crisis and conflict is that they then risk to be subject to child marriage. The family may marry them away in order to be able to get some money. Or the girl is sent to work. She might be 8 years, 9 years. So instead of going to school, she will be out working. She might be drawn into trafficking. And in the war economy, is often has a strong element of trafficking and prostitution. They might be drawn into early childbirth, being 10, 11, 12 years old to have a child. So there are so many dangers and threats towards girls in particular. This is not to say that boys are not also suffering. They are. Those who are suffering also are those children with disabilities. So even before COVID-19, they were refugees and they may not have access to educational facilities that would provide them support to attend school because they were in a wheelchair or similar. And now they're out of school, no livelihood, no learning, and they are also have disabilities. So, there's a large segment of this population that are particularly vulnerable. Now, we need solutions. So what education cannot wait as a global fund, we are hosted by UNICEF, but we serve the whole UN system. And then we work with private sector because they have a very big role to play. So since the breakout of COVID-19, and of course we are in the multilateral UN system, which is a crisis responder, we are able to move very fast. Education Cannot Wait had worked with all our partners, UN agencies, civil society, host governments in about 26 countries, such as the Sahel, such as Afghanistan, Palestine, Syria, the Rohingyas, and so forth, to deliver COVID-19 emergency response. And distributed funding 23 million. And next week we are dispersing an additional 21 million. So in total, about $45 million have been dispersed by Education Cannot Wait by the end of next week to 30 countries affected by crisis. Where did this money go? It goes to getting all the agencies and the government, led by the government, UN agencies and civil society, and communities and the refugees themselves come together to establish creative solutions during the out-of-school situation. Schools are used for hygiene, so that they wash their hands and keep clean, not to get infected by COVID-19. Radio apparates and enabling them to hook up to receive learning through radio and television, short-term radio and television, where computers and technology is possible, school feeding, so that every child gets that daily school feeding, which they would never access otherwise, material, school books, and also we pay all the teachers serving them within our investments. Because just because of COVID-19, the teacher must not suffer and lose their livelihood. We need them during COVID-19. Whether they are part of using the school to distribute sanitation and hygiene, or they deliver books at the doorstep of the children, or they are part of social distance learning where they can keep the 9 or 6 feet separation. So there are many creative ways of delivering a continuing education. One more thing that we do is that because education is also protection, there are hotlines for children, especially girls, who feel threatened and as a result of the COVID-19 threats. I mentioned a few to you. Hotlines and mentorship and support. However, this is not enough. And we also work and are rolling out our multi-year investments, which are more development oriented, so that when we now move from the recovery of COVID-19, from the emergency into the recovery in 30 crisis countries, 25 crisis countries, we are also rolling out our multi-year investments that will help build back better. For us, education is the foundation to build back better. Without education, we cannot achieve development. We cannot achieve the sustainable development goals. We need to invest in the human mind and the human soul of the new generation, and especially the children and youth who are today suffering doubly. They're suffering in addition of the conflicts and crisis and the poverty, because they grow up in violence, in a total breakdown of any protection that every child needs. And for us to achieve the sustainable development goals and also to achieve the 1919 Johnson Agreement, which means that everyone should have right to basic learning, we need to start with those who are left furthest behind. Because if we lose them, that will one day come back upon all of us. 75 million children and youth who do not have access to education, and all they see is violence, all they see is suffering, all they see is poverty, war, flight, no home. Either they will succumb to that human suffering and never arise again, or they will use whatever tool they have to fight back. Without an education, you cannot stand up against that suffering peacefully without violence. Education gives them the tools to arise out of this, to become productive citizens, to be empowered, and to make sure it never happens again. Education is their hope and their tool to become the most beautiful potential and the most productive fellow human being, and that they can be for their people, their societies, and for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sharif. Even though we are thousands of miles apart from France and Thailand, we can feel your energy and your passion that I hope is the same magnitude as the problem that we face globally nowadays. So we're so happy to have the organization like you, that we share the same passion and goals. And now I would like to invite our colleagues that run the same kind of organization, an education fund for the most vulnerable and the most deprived population around the world. May I now invite Ms. Alice Albright, the Chief Executive Officer of Global Partnership for Education, or GPE, to be our next speaker. Ms. Alice Albright, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join you from afar. Very much appreciated. And it's a great pleasure to be with everybody. Let me start by explaining a little bit about what GPE does. The Global Partnership for Education is a partnership and a fund dedicated to SDG 4 to make sure that all children have an inclusive, equitable, and quality education. GPE believes that education systems need to be strengthened to deliver quality education to all children. So we support the development and implementation of education sector plans through funding, and critically by activating the partnership of key education stakeholders at both the global and the country levels. We work for children most in need in nearly 70 developing countries across the world. And so far, GPE has mobilized more than $7 billion for education, and our support reaches over 360 million children around the world. Equity and inclusion is at GPE's core. And in fact, they are the core pillars of our work. And while we've made significant progress in our working with our partner countries towards these goals, of course, we have a long way to go to reach SDG 4. Before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, an estimated 258 million children, adolescents, and youth, in fact, 17% of the world's total, were still not in school. Many of them have come from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. They are excluded from education because of the wider political, social, and economic factors like poverty, like early childhood marriage, fragility, violence, gender, disability, or in fact, the effects of poor health and nutrition. According to the 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report, in low and middle income countries, adolescents from the richest 20% of households are 3 times as likely as those from the poorest households to complete lower secondary school. So you can see that there are wide disparities. The poorest children are also more than twice as likely to be malnourished, which of course impedes their ability to learn. And children with disabilities are less likely to start school or transition to secondary school. There's a lack of understanding of their needs. There's a lack of trained teachers. There's a lack of sufficient support and resources, which often mean that children with disabilities lag behind their peers in gaining foundational learning. What has been the impact of COVID-19? COVID-19 has only worsened the situation, triggering in many ways an unprecedented learning crisis. As the world was locked down to slow the spread of COVID-19, 1.6 billion children were left out of school, and more than half of these lived in developing countries. Closing schools was necessary to save lives, but the longer that children are actually out of school, the higher the costs. School closures pose a monumental challenge for the equity and inclusion in education, exacerbating inequalities and discriminatory patterns that push children out of an education. In fact, we saw this same pattern with girls during the Ebola outbreak 5 years ago in West Africa. As schools closed, girls suffered more gender-based violence, early child marriage, teenage pregnancy, domestic violence, and child labor, and many were not able to return to school. In fact, if we see the same dropout rates today from COVID as we did see with the Ebola crisis, it is estimated that 10 million secondary school-age girls may not return to school at all after the pandemic. This is a report that was produced by the Malala Foundation just recently. And let's not forget the huge economic shocks of COVID-19. More than 70 million people and children will likely be pushed into extreme poverty this year alone, 70 million people. The global economy is projected to contract sharply by as much as 5.2% in 2020. This would represent the deepest recession since the Second World War. Think about that. Emerging market and developing economies alone are expected to shrink by 2.5%. This is a disaster. It means less government revenues and smaller budgets for education. It means plunging household incomes and much less money to pay for school fees and school needs. Parents, in fact, might have to choose which child to send to school. And vulnerable groups like girls and children with disabilities are often the ones that are chosen to stay out of school and be left behind. There's also going to be falling international aid for education, which means that we might lose crucial funding for support for education in low-income countries. And then finally, there will very much be an impact on earnings. Earnings will be lost. Every bit of time that children are out of school, losing the opportunity to learn, it creates a long-term loss in their earning potential over the course of their lives, which cannot be recovered. So even as we rightly focus on the health response, we must maintain and strengthen our investments in education, because education is critical to dealing with both the long-term and the short-term impacts of COVID-19. Let's just think about schools for a minute. Schools are the institution with the largest community reach in countries. Schools deliver important social protection like nutrition and food security. Schools disseminate health messaging and so can support public health campaigns like hand washing, wearing masks, distributing vaccines. And in the long term, education contributes to social stability and provides better economic prospects for learners. This is the only sustainable way out of the economic crisis that we face. With schools closed, we risk sliding further back on equity and inclusion in education as more vulnerable children remain out of school. This makes continuing education ever more important, and it gives us an opportunity, in fact, to reimagine and reinvent education for the future. What is GPE doing about COVID? At GPE, we are deeply concerned about children at the margins of education systems who face exclusion, like refugees, children with special learning needs or disabilities, children from the poorest households and communities, and those living remotely. To respond to their needs, we're asking ourselves some very critical questions. Can we use distance learning techniques to deliver education to vulnerable children, including those who were out of school before the pandemic? Can we begin to ensure education is considered a key social protection tool and linked to broader social sector spending in health, WASH, nutrition, and safety, for example? So far, GPE has mobilized very rapidly, just over $500 million, $510 million to be precise, to support developing countries to respond to their immediate and long-term impacts of the pandemic on education. Now, GPE is the world's largest funder supporting education impacts of COVID-19 in developing countries. These grants include several components. The vast majority of the funding, $475 million, will take the form of direct country grants for countries who are impacted by COVID. And this money we expect to go to almost all of our country partners who apply for it. $25 million will support a set of shared approaches at what we call the global level. This money will be distributed to some of our global partners, and it will be used to research and try to pilot different approaches around distance learning. We also responded quickly as school closures swept across the globe in March. And our first effort was just under $9 million going to all of our country partners to help them plan for their response in the pandemic and to plan how they would respond to it. The country grants, getting back to that, respond to the needs that have been identified by the countries, and you can find profiles of all of our country grants on our website, along with quite a bit of other data that sort of portrays the response that GPE has. Summarizing very briefly, the response falls into four main areas: learning continuity, especially for the most vulnerable, teacher support, safely reopening schools, and strengthening the resilience of education systems. About 1/3 of GPE's COVID response funds will go directly to supporting greater equity and inclusion. Let me give you some examples from the Asia Pacific region. First, regarding disadvantaged students. In Bhutan and Indonesia, GPE is supporting education continuity through learning materials, especially for the hard to reach in poor and rural communities. With regard to students with disabilities, in Cambodia, GPE is supporting sign language translation of video lessons. In Kyrgyzstan, GPE is supporting online remote learning platforms and content in local languages for all children, including children with disabilities. Many grants support girls through campaigns to prevent all forms of violence against girls, including early marriage, providing psychosocial support. And we're also supporting countries to develop their distance learning capabilities and build resilient education systems for the future. With GPE support, countries are investing in radio, television, and distributing print materials to keep children learning. So in closing, let us think about the future and think about building back better. The pandemic is making us face education challenges head on and urging us to act swiftly to overcome them. For GPE, this means transforming education systems to be truly inclusive so that nobody is left behind. In fact, GPE is developing a new strategic plan to guide our work over the next 5 years. This will be called GPE 2025. We are committed to supporting developing countries to transform, I'll say it again, to transform their education systems, to scale up innovation, to address equity in learning through building resilient education systems. We know that much more needs to be done. And later this year, with the launch of GPE's financing campaign, with new donor investments, we know that we can deliver quality education to even more children, especially the most vulnerable and marginalized. So keep an eye out for our replenishment campaign, which will be sometime mid next year, and it will enable us to have a renewed amount of funding to think further about these goals. And with our investment in COVID-19 education response, we will hope to be one step closer to a world where not even a pandemic can stand in the way of education for all children. So let me thank you once again for inviting me to join you from afar. I certainly wish I was with you there in person, and I wish you well with the rest of the conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Albright. Last but not least, I would like to invite Dr. Prasan to share EEF recent hands-on experience in fighting COVID-19 in Thailand and the funds way forward.
For EEF, we have relatively more humble experiences compared with ECW and GPE. But drawing from the EEF's experience both before the COVID-19 and in the past few months, there were 5 important strategies, I think, that had supported equitable education for Thai children and youth, particularly the vulnerable ones. I would say that the first strategy is speed, trying to get ahead of the crisis and its consequences. In March 2020, some 4 months ago, before the pandemic reached its peak in Thailand, and when schools were still open, the EF board signaled to the management team to conduct a national survey in helping devise practical and timely solutions. The survey, which covered over 10,000 frontline teachers and school directors, addressed the critical impacts of COVID-19 on children and their families. The results showed that if school shutdown was imminent, the most serious problem than schooling was hunger, particularly among the poorest families. In response, the EF board swiftly approved the emergency budgeting of over $16 million to provide 30-day food packages to over 700,000 extremely poor children across Thailand. We also raised over $500,000 of both in cash and in kind from donations to help the most vulnerable groups, including 30,000 children with severe acute malnutrition. I would say the second strategy is about social protection and equitable education. Before any schooling can start, a child should be healthy and ready to learn. No child should go without food or risk their life traveling to school. Equitable education, therefore, goes beyond just equitable learning opportunities, but also include food security, family security, travel safety, school security, and community security. These 5 securities or the social protection in education system will be the bedrocks of the equitable education for our children in this post-COVID society. I would say the third strategy is the agility, ready to adjust our business process and identify new partners to address knowledge and capacity gaps. As COVID-19 has disrupted every child, we must respond quickly to get ahead. Equitable education is no longer just about classroom-based face-to-face schooling. It is about social protection and other factors of child development. Schools must embrace the reality that education and good supporting systems are necessary to promote equitable education anywhere and at any time, whether it be at a student's home or school or online or at any place. The fourth strategy is independence. To successfully execute the three strategies above, we need certain amount of autonomy on the following key elements. One is data. The highest quality data is fundamental to any successful crisis management. Given time constraint and travel restrictions, innovative approach to data collection and analytics are instrumental to overcome the crisis. More importantly, data sharing among agencies is very crucial in promoting integrated policies and implementations at all levels. Two would be resources. To address the emergency needs in a timely manner, we need to be able to independently mobilize sizable resources that match the scale of the problem. Not all resources need to come through us to reach the target population, but there should be a strategic alignment among different partners to effectively mobilize resources to tackle the crisis. Multiple approaches to resource allocation, either universal or targeting programs, should be employed to complement each other in this time of crisis. And three is decision-making, as equitable education must be above politics and bureaucracy. Under the Constitution of Thailand and the EEF Act of 2018, drafted by the Independent Committee for Education Reform, the EEF board has certain independence to make tough and sometimes unconventional calls to address problems. This is crucial to realizing equitable education innovatively and effectively during this global pandemic. The fifth strategy, all for education. It takes a village to raise a child. COVID-19 has made this African wisdom even more relevant in the past few months. We no longer expect just schools alone to provide education for our children in light of the pandemic. Everyone in the society, private sector, families, NGOs, civil society must come together to help our children overcome this greatest challenge to humanity. These are some of our experiences and lessons during the first 2 years of our operation in Thailand. We are eager to learn and share experiences and knowledges with our international colleagues so that we can all move closer towards achieving equitable education goals and SDG 4 by 2030. This we hope to be the spirit of this international conference. Your Royal Highness and Mr. Chair, we hope our colleagues at international, regional, and national levels could benefit and enjoy the next 2 days of the first virtual international conference on equitable education, all for education. The other 4 plenaries and 15 parallel sessions will illustrate the potential game changers for equitable education in the last 10 years of SDG 4, including area-based education, innovative financing, and equity-based budgeting, as well as the roles of data and technology and public-private partnership. On behalf of our organizations, we hope you feel inspired by this agenda. And be safe anywhere you are in the world.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prasan. I would like to invite all three speakers to make their closing remark before we conclude this plenary session. Ms. Jasmine, would you like to add anything at the end of this session?
Thank you very much. It's been a very interesting panel discussion. I have really been inspired by being in your presence today. I very much agree with what everyone has said, but I would like to go back to what Dr. Prasan mentioned so rightly, being the top priorities. We need access to data to measure and ensure that no one is left furthest behind, but also in order to measure learning so that we achieve learning outcomes. That's an area that needs improvement. We need to take affirmative action to make sure that those who are marginalized, the girls, the children with disabilities, the refugees, the displaced, are also included in the public school system. And we need to mobilize the resources. We calculate that 3.8 billion a year would be required if we were to deliver a quality education to those who have their education disrupted. So we are speaking about large amounts. And instead of investing in conflict and wars and military expenditures, invest in humanity. It's more cost effective and it's more humane. And finally, we need to make sure that education of the 21st century, it has the numerical skills, literacy, very important for children in conflict and crisis, but for all children, the social and emotional learning, technology. But what we need more than ever today, looking at how the world looks today, we need the ethical frameworks, the value system, the global coexistence, the sense of responsibility towards one another, and a sense of us being one humanity. And that starts early. It starts from the time the child is born and goes to school and grows up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sharif.
So, Ms. Alice, all right, if you're ready, please share us the closing remark before we close this plenary session. Thank you.
Your Royal Highness, it's been a great pleasure to be here and a great honor. And I wish we were all together in person. Let me end perhaps by touching on a couple of things. I understand that my dear friend and colleague, Yasmin Sharif from ECW, Education Cannot Wait, has also spent some time with you. You know, we think in some ways that there's kind of a continuum between the development challenges associated with education and the humanitarian challenges associated with education. And what makes sense is to work kind of across a bridge across that continuum, and getting a chance to work with ECW enables us to do so. Your second question was overall about equity, and I'm delighted to hear what you explained about Thailand's own domestic efforts around equity. I congratulate you for that. If GPE does not have all the answers by any means, but if you think there's anything in terms of advice or what have you that we can provide, we'd be delighted to be in touch with you informally about that. I think if you go back to the COVID pandemic, what it has laid bare is the huge degree of inequity in education. And we see it based on who's being left out of school. We are very worried that girls will permanently be left out of school because we saw that following the Ebola crisis. Clearly, one of the solutions to the pandemic is leaning further into distance learning at both high tech, low tech, no tech, mid tech. It's not just high tech. And we need to look at is distance learning, provided it's done well and teachers are involved and the curriculums are appropriate and so forth. But it has to be done so in a way that does not exacerbate the already equity divides. So that's a very tricky thing to get right, because when the pandemic is over with, which we all surely hope is soon, we can't wake up in a world where the inequities have actually gotten worse. So there's a really tricky policy and implementation pathway to navigate here. You mentioned in terms of some of the things that Thailand is contemplating, conditional cash transfers to reach out to the most remote areas. We would very much encourage that, because one of the overall impacts of the pandemic is going to be a macroeconomic impact. And so it's going to mean, for various reasons, whether or not it's budgetary sources from governments, international aid, remittances, jobs, household incomes, all of it is going to be negatively impacted, I'm afraid to say, for a while. And it's going to mean that children who are the most vulnerable from a poverty perspective are going to be in an even more disadvantaged position in terms of their ability to get back to school. So focusing on ways to get money to the most disadvantaged families to enable them to get their children back to school, or access to the distance learning tools that are necessary, I think is a vital part of the response, so that we don't wind up coming out of the pandemic with greater inequity than we have now. And this is really at the heart of my organization's work. And to the extent that we can maybe provide a little bit of, we don't have all the answers. And I think the whole world is just trying to figure that out. So we really don't have all the answers. But if there's any bit of information that we could provide to Thailand, we would be happy to do so. And I wish you all the best of luck in your own efforts to try to contend with the crisis. Very best wishes and good luck.
Thank you very much, Ms. Albright. Dr. Prasan, would you like to add something?
Well, for me, I think it's a very valuable experience to have this opportunity to listen to Jasmine's presentation on ECW work and Alice on GPE. Certainly, although we share the common spirit, goals, but look like the environment, both of them are working in much more challenging than in our case, EEF. Jasmine talk about war, violence, and so on. And in the case of GPE, also a broader perspective, broader variety of people to deal with. So this serves as a very great encouragement for the future work of the EEF. And as I mentioned in the very beginning, this is also very useful for us to have something to look up to as benchmark and as inspiration for us. Thank you very much for our two colleagues.
Thank you, Dr. Prasan. Your Royal Highness and Mr. Chair, we have come to the end of this plenary, and we can see that all three organizations, 2 global funds, 1 national fund, have shared the same spirit to the most vulnerable population of the world, the children of the world. Their commitment to equitable education at both international and national level is unparalleled. And I thank so much for the attention from all participants who join us from around the world today. This is our first international conference on equitable education, All for Education. In this remarkable situation around the world, the idea of All for Education cannot be compared to anything else. I wish you enjoy this first plenary session whenever you are. And I hope you find the rest of the conference equally inspiring and beneficial to your works on equitable education and to your course on the SDG 4 anywhere. Thank you, and please be safe and stay healthy. Goodbye for now. Thank you.